The room went quiet when HR pushed the document toward me and said the words that still echo years later. This reflects your new compensation. A 55% pay cut, effective immediately. Same workload, same clients. Decide by tomorrow, no warning, no negotiation. Just a smile and a pen waiting for my signature. 9 years of loyalty reduced to a number on a page. That was the moment the line was crossed, and they knew it. What they didn't know was how fast everything would unravel after that meeting. If you've ever been cornered like this at work, you'll understand what comes next. Subscribe if this sounds familiar, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. The conference room smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner, and before anyone spoke, Megan from HR slid a single page across the table and said, "This reflects your new compensation, effective immediately." And I remember answering, "I'm sorry, can you repeat that?" Because the number didn't make sense the first time I saw it. Paul Hargreaves didn't look at me when he spoke, just stared at his laptop and said, "We're adjusting your salary to align with the updated role," as if that phrase could soften what came next. 55% gone, same title, same clients, same responsibilities. I pushed the paper back slightly and said, "This has to be a mistake." And Megan shook her head and replied, "It's not a mistake. This is the offer." Paul finally looked up then, folded his hands and added, "You'll continue managing the same accounts during the transition. We need stability." That was the moment the humiliation landed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with surgical precision. They were taking my authority, my pay, and my leverage while still expecting me to hold the structure together for them. I asked calmly, "Is there any room for discussion?" And Paul smiled thinly and said, "This is not a negotiation." Megan slid a pen toward me, the click echoing too loudly in the room, and said, "We'll need your answer by tomorrow so we can plan next steps." I remember saying, "So to be clear, you're cutting my pay in half and keeping my workload exactly the same." And Paul responded, "This is about the future of the organization," which told me everything I needed to know about how little the present mattered to them. I felt heat rise in my face, but I kept my voice steady and said, "You're asking me to absorb this immediately." And Megan nodded and said, "Yes," then added without looking at me, "We understand this is difficult." That word, understand, hung there empty. I glanced at the paper again, at the bold number that meant my mortgage, my daughter's therapy appointments, my margin for error, all erased in a single line, and I realized this wasn't a cost adjustment, it was pressure, applied deliberately. I asked, "What happens if I say no?" And Paul leaned back and said, "Then we'll have to assume you're not aligned with the new structure." And Megan finished the sentence for him. "In that case, we'll begin looking for someone who is." The message was clear: accept the cut or make yourself expendable. I looked at the pen again and said, "I need time to review this," and Megan replied, "You have until tomorrow," tapping her watch as if to underline the deadline. That was the second humiliation, the clock, the assumption that fear would do the work for them. I gathered the paper, folded it once, and said, "I'll follow up." And Paul nodded, already moving on in his mind, already done with me. When I stood to leave, no one stood with me. No one thanked me for the accounts I'd held together through every change, every merger call, every angry client escalation. I walked out of that room knowing something had broken, not emotionally, but structurally. They had crossed a line and called it policy. In the hallway, Megan's voice followed me as she said, "We appreciate your professionalism." And I didn't turn around because if I did, I would have said what professionalism actually felt like in that moment. By the time I reached the elevator, the decision wasn't made yet, but the damage was. They believed the paper and the deadline were enough to corner me. They believed I would shrink. They believed I would sign. And that belief, more than the number itself, was the betrayal that made everything that followed inevitable. The elevator doors closed, and I didn't exhale until I reached the parking garage, where the concrete felt colder than usual and my phone vibrated once in my hand, a single interruption that cut through the fog before it could settle. I sat in the car without starting it, unfolded the paper again, then folded it back the same way, as if repetition might dull the edges. And that was when the call came through from a number I hadn't seen in months. Zoe. Lena's voice sounded cautious, like she already knew the answer to a question she hadn't asked yet, and I said, "Yeah," keeping my eyes on the steering wheel because looking anywhere else felt like too much. She didn't waste time. "I heard something's going down over there," she said, and I asked, "Who told you?" Even though I already knew the company wasn't as quiet as it thought it was. "People talk," she replied, then paused just long enough to make the next part land. "I'm at Iron Peak now. We've been tracking what Helixer is doing to your division, and your name keeps coming up." I started the engine then, more out of habit than intent, and said, "This is a bad time," which made her laugh softly. "That's why I'm calling," she said. She told me her team had been circling 3 of my accounts for months and couldn't get past one consistent obstacle. Me. Not my title, not the company logo, just the fact that the clients trusted my word. I pulled out of the garage and merged into traffic, letting her talk while I watched the city slide past, familiar but suddenly distant, like I was already leaving it. "We need someone who understands continuity, not just sales," she said, "and who knows how these transitions actually break." I didn't answer right away, and she didn't push. When I finally spoke, I said, "They just cut my pay by more than half and told me to decide by tomorrow." And she went quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't surprise, but confirmation. "That tracks," she said finally. "They're clearing the deck." I asked her what she meant, and she said, "They do this before they externalize client ownership. You either accept less or remove yourself from the equation." I changed lanes, checked the mirror, and asked, "Why are you telling me this?" She didn't hesitate. "Because you're about to make a decision based on incomplete information," she said, "and because Iron Peak would like to talk to you before that happens." I told her I wasn't looking for a job, which felt like the right thing to say, even as it stopped being true. "You don't have to be," she replied. "Just be willing to listen." We agreed on a short meeting the next morning. Neutral location, no offices, no badges. And when the call ended, I realized my hands were steady again. At home, I put the paper on the kitchen counter and didn't look at it while I made dinner, helped with homework, and kept my voice normal because nothing had changed yet, not officially. After bedtime, I opened my laptop and didn't log into any company system. I pulled up my own files instead, the ones built from memory and follow-ups and promises kept, and I understood something then that hadn't been clear in the conference room. The deadline they'd given me wasn't meant to force a decision. It was meant to stop me from talking to anyone who might remind me that the number on that page wasn't the measure of my value. After the house went quiet, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and a legal pad beside it, not rushing, not panicking, just pulling threads to see which ones came loose, because if they were going to compress my future into 24 hours, I needed facts, not feelings. I started with my employment agreement, the original one, the kind written when companies still assumed loyalty was enough to keep people, and I read it end to end without skimming, noting dates, signatures, language that hadn't been updated since before the acquisition. There it was, plain and unguarded, no non-compete, no non-solicitation, and a compensation protection clause that triggered relief if pay was reduced beyond a defined threshold, which they had already crossed. I checked the Amendments tab and found nothing newer than 3 years old. No acknowledgement of Helixer's policies, no reissued terms, just a corporate assumption that inertia would cover their gaps. I didn't. Celebrate, I verified. I pulled emails announcing the acquisition, the town hall slides, the HR FAQ that promised continuity for legacy staff, and compared them to what had been handed to me that morning. Because alignment matters when people start arguing about intent. The language didn't match. The promises were broader. The paper they slid across the table was narrower and colder, and that difference mattered. I made a list of what they could demand and what they couldn't, and the list surprised me by how short it was. They could cut my pay. They could threaten my role. They could not require a transition once compensation dropped past the line they themselves had drawn years earlier. They could not restrict where I work next. They could not claim ownership of relationships built without proprietary tools or confidential data, which was most of what I had. When I finished, I closed the agreement and didn't reopen it, because the point wasn't to argue later, it was to decide now. I packed the pad into my bag for the morning meeting and set an alarm earlier than usual, then went to bed without rereading the paper from HR, because I already knew what it said and what it didn't. The next morning, I arrived at the cafe a few minutes early and chose a table with a clear view of the door, not out of paranoia, but habit. And when Lena walked in with Ethan Brooks a few steps behind her, I stood, shook hands, and sat without preamble. Ethan didn't waste time. "We're not here to poach," he said. "We're here to understand." I told them exactly what had happened, keeping it factual, sticking to numbers, deadlines, and words used, and watched Ethan's expression change at one specific point, the moment I mentioned the lack of updated contracts. He asked a single question. "Did they ask you to sign anything new?" I said no, and he nodded once, as if a calculation had finished. He didn't pitch. He asked about client expectations during transitions, about failure points after acquisitions, about which promises broke first, and how customers reacted when accountability blurred, and I answered without naming names or sharing anything that wasn't mine to share, because boundaries matter when leverage is clean. When he did talk numbers, he framed them as scope and responsibility, not rescue, and that distinction told me more than the figures themselves. "We need someone who can stabilize change without theatrics," he said, "and who knows when to draw a line." I told him I had a line already, and he smiled, not because it amused him, but because it clarified something. We wrapped the meeting without shaking on anything, just an agreement to keep talking, and when I left, I didn't feel like I was fleeing or being recruited. I felt like I was standing on solid ground for the first time since the paper crossed the table. Back in my car, I checked the time once, then put the phone face down and drove because the deadline hadn't moved, but my position had, and that was the leverage they hadn't planned for. Ethan didn't bring a folder or slide anything across the table, which immediately told me this wasn't going to mirror the meeting from the day before. And when he spoke, it was measured and specific in a way that felt unfamiliar after months of vague corporate language. He said, "We don't hire people because their companies are failing." Then paused just long enough to let the implication land. "We hire them because they're the reason clients stay when everything else changes." He asked me to describe one recent transition I'd managed, not the success story, but the friction where it almost broke, and I walked him through it step by step, focusing on decisions, timing, and consequences rather than personalities. He listened without interrupting, then asked a follow-up that cut straight to the center. How much of that work depended on systems and how much depended on trust? I answered honestly, trust carries the system when the system lags. And he nodded, as if that confirmed something he already believed. He told me Iron Peak had lost bids to my company repeatedly over the last few years, not because their product was inferior, but because clients were unwilling to risk losing continuity during critical periods. And then he said my name in that sentence, not as praise, but as explanation. When he finally talked about compensation, it wasn't framed as a counter or a rescue, it was framed as alignment. Role scope, authority over client continuity, a team structured around execution rather than reporting, and pay that reflected responsibility without drama. I didn't react immediately, which he seemed to expect, and instead asked why now, why this moment, and that's when the missing piece surfaced. Ethan leaned back and said, "Because Helixer isn't restructuring, they're clearing the path, and when I asked for clarification, he didn't soften it. He told me their playbook was to reduce senior compensation enough to prompt exits without triggering severance obligations, then externalize client-facing roles to third-party vendors once institutional knowledge had walked itself out the door. He said it calmly, like someone describing weather patterns, and added, "Your role was scheduled to disappear regardless of what you chose." That sentence reframed the meeting from the day before in a way that made the humiliation sharper, not because it hurt more, but because it made the intent unmistakable. The pay cut wasn't a negotiation tactic, it was a holding pattern designed to extract what they still needed before letting the position collapse. I asked how he knew, and he said their operations lead had implemented the same sequence at a previous firm, same timing, same language, same outcome, and that Iron Peak tracked these things because client disruption created opportunity. I looked down at my coffee, now cold, and realized the clock they'd put on me wasn't about urgency, it was about control. Ethan told me they weren't asking for a decision that day, but he did outline what starting would look like if I chose to move forward, including a start date that respected transition boundaries I was no longer obligated to honor. I asked about legal exposure, and he answered directly, outlining what their counsel had already reviewed based on publicly available policy changes and my original agreement, which told me this wasn't impulsive on their end either. When we stood to leave, he said one thing that stayed with me. The people who try to compress your choices are usually the ones afraid of what happens if you have time to think. I drove back to the office afterward, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to see the building with different information in my pocket. And as I walked past familiar faces and half-empty desks, I understood the scope of what was actually being dismantled. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed once with a calendar invite from HR titled Follow Up, scheduled for the next morning, and I didn't open it right away because for the first time since the paper had crossed the table, the deadline felt irrelevant. The decision wasn't made yet, but the power dynamic had shifted, and that shift explained everything they'd done, from the language they used to the silence they expected in return. The follow-up meeting was scheduled for 9 sharp, which told me they expected compliance, not conversation. And when I walked into the same conference room, the paper was already waiting in a new folder, as if presentation could soften outcome. Megan gestured for me to sit and said, "We're here to confirm your decision." And I answered, "Before I give it, I need clarity." Keeping my voice even because clarity was the only leverage left in that room. Paul closed his laptop and said, "We really need a yes or no. Today." And I replied, "Then this should be quick," and placed my notebook on the table without opening it. I asked who would be responsible for 3 specific client renewals scheduled within the next 60 days, naming them in order, not as a threat, but as a fact, and Paul waved it off with, "Those assignments will be redistributed," which told me redistribution meant uncertainty. I asked whether the pay reduction would be reversed once the transition stabilized, and Megan said, "This is the structure going forward," without meeting my eyes. I asked if the role would remain domestic through the end of the year, and Paul paused long enough to confirm what I already knew before saying, "Those decisions are still being evaluated." I nodded once and said, "Then I'm going to be very clear," and slid the folder back toward them unopened. "I'm declining the revised compensation and resigning effective immediately." The room shifted in a way that can't be faked, a sudden alertness that only appears when control slips, and Paul said, "That's not how this works," which made Megan look at him sharply. I answered, "It is under my agreement," and explained briefly without embellishment the clause triggered by compensation reduction and the waiver of transition obligations attached to it, watching as Megan's pen stopped moving. Paul said, "You can't just walk out," and I replied, "I can and I am, because accuracy matters when people start posturing." He tried again, this time with authority, saying, "You're expected to provide continuity," and I said, "Continuity requires authority, and you removed that yesterday." Megan cleared her throat and asked, "Where will you be going?" And I said, "Well, that's not relevant." Then corrected myself, "But since you'll ask anyway, I've accepted an offer elsewhere." Paul's expression hardened. "With a competitor?" he asked, and I answered, "Yes, because ambiguity only benefits the people who created the mess." He leaned forward and said, "You should be aware we'll be reviewing your communications." And I responded, "You should," then added, "I've been careful." The word careful landed harder than anything else I could have said. Megan finally spoke, quieter now, asking if I would reconsider with an adjustment. And I said, "This wasn't about adjustment, because it wasn't. It was about being cornered and expected to thank them for the pressure." I stood, gathered my notebook, and said, "Please send any future correspondence to my personal email." And Paul said, "This is a mistake. which sounded smaller than he intended. As I walked out, I didn't look back, not because I was angry, but because the meeting was already over the moment the folder touched the table. In the hallway, security was waiting, polite and uncomfortable, and I handed over my badge without comment because badges don't carry value once trust is gone. At my desk, I packed efficiently, ignoring the stares and the silence, and when a colleague asked if the rumors were true, I said, "I'm leaving," and nothing else, because explanations create openings. The elevator ride down was short, and when the doors opened, the building felt lighter, as if the weight I'd been carrying had been structural, not emotional. Outside, the air was cold and clear, and for the first time since the paper appeared, there was no clock ticking in my head, just a clean line drawn where compliance used to be. The first sign that the decision had consequences came before noon, when my phone buzzed with a message from someone who never contacted me directly, asking if I was still on point for an upcoming review, and I answered with a single sentence, "I'm no longer with the company." That was all it took to crack the surface. By early afternoon, my former team was fielding questions they weren't authorized to answer, and I could tell from the way the messages were forwarded to me privately that the internal script hadn't caught up with reality. One client asked who would be handling an implementation milestone that had my name written into the agreement. Another wanted confirmation that the person they'd been introduced to would still have decision authority. A third simply wrote, "This feels unstable," and that word carried more weight than any complaint. I didn't respond beyond what was appropriate, because restraint mattered now, but I watched the pattern form as calls stacked and timelines slipped. That evening, an unfamiliar number called, and when I answered, a voice introduced himself as part of Helixer's legal team, speaking carefully, outlining expectations around confidentiality and cooperation, and I listened without interrupting until he finished. When he asked if I understood, I said, "I understand my obligations," and nothing more, which ended the call faster than argument would have. The next morning, Iron Peak's counsel briefed me on what they were seeing from the outside. Delayed responses, reassigned accounts with no handoff context, and a sudden spike in executive involvement that suggested panic, not control. By midday, Paul left a voicemail asking if we could talk through a few open items. His tone flatter than before, and I deleted it without replying, not out of spite, but because clarity had already been provided. Over the next few days, the escalation became visible to people who had previously believed transitions were invisible to customers. A scheduled client steering meeting was postponed twice. A promised follow-up never arrived. A temporary point of contact changed 3 times in 1 week. None of it looked dramatic from the inside, but from the outside, it looked like drift, and drift erodes confidence faster than mistakes. I received a call from a senior executive I'd met once in passing, asking if there was anything we could do to stabilize the situation, and I answered honestly, stability requires continuity, and continuity requires trust. Then let the silence do the rest of the work. That afternoon, 2 former colleagues resigned, not loudly, not together, just quietly enough to deepen the gap. And when Iron Peak extended offers to both, it wasn't framed as a win, just as a solution to an immediate need. Internally, Helixer tried to reassert control through process, sending long emails about escalation paths and interim coverage, but process can't replace familiarity when timelines are tight. Clients don't want explanations when delivery falters. They want names, and those names had been removed without warning. By the end of the week, the narrative had shifted from cost alignment to unexpected turnover, and that shift mattered because it reframed the cause from market forces to management decisions. I stayed deliberately quiet because anything louder would have been unnecessary, and watched as the consequences unfolded in measurable ways. Delayed renewals, increased executive calls, and a visible change in how often my former employer appeared on competitor shortlists. When someone forwarded me an internal message asking teams to remain calm and unified, I knew the message wasn't for them, it was for leadership. The damage wasn't explosive, it was cumulative, and that made it harder to deny. At Iron Peak, my calendar filled with onboarding meetings focused on immediate continuity, not future planning, and the contrast was sharp. One system absorbed the shock and moved forward. The other tried to explain it away. By the time a formal request arrived asking if I would consider consulting temporarily to smooth the transition, the answer had already been given through action, not words. I declined politely, because the point wasn't to fix what had been broken. After the fact, it was to stop accepting structures that treated people as interchangeable until they weren't. The damage had become visible, and once visibility sets in, control doesn't come back the way it left. Time did what it always does after conflict. It stripped the noise away and left only outcomes. And once the calls slowed and the headlines inside the building shifted to something else, the difference between where I'd been and where I was became measurable instead of emotional. At Iron Peak, the work stabilized quickly because authority and responsibility were aligned, and that alignment removed the friction I had spent years absorbing without realizing it. Clients didn't need reassurances or speeches, they needed consistency, and once they saw the same names in meetings week after week, the anxiety drained out of their voices. Within months, several accounts made their decisions quietly, not as a statement, but as a correction. And when those announcements landed, no one framed them as losses or wins, just as transitions. That made sense given the circumstances. I was promoted into a role that matched what I had been doing all along, with a team size to the scope instead of budget optics, and the difference showed up in delivery timelines and renewal cycles that stopped wobbling. From the outside, Helixer responded the way large organizations often do when consequences become undeniable. Leadership changes were announced, processes were reviewed, and a message about recommitment to people circulated internally, polished and carefully worded. Some salaries were adjusted. Some roles were quietly reinstated. None of it came with an admission of error, and none of it needed to. The system corrected itself just enough to survive, which is what systems like that are designed to do. Occasionally, someone would reach out to ask how it felt to see the fallout, expecting satisfaction or vindication, and I always answered the same way. It felt inevitable. What surprised me wasn't that clients moved or executives were replaced. It was how quickly everything normalized once the pressure point was removed. The fear that had been presented as leverage evaporated the moment it stopped working, and what replaced it was something steadier, a clear understanding of where my boundaries were and why they mattered. At home, the changes were quieter but more significant. Evenings stopped feeling like borrowed time. Plans were made without contingency language. Work stayed at work more often than not, and when it didn't, it came with authority instead of apology. The story, when people asked for it, shortened itself over time because the details that once felt sharp lost their edge, leaving a simple sequence of cause and effect. A decision was forced, information was gathered, a line was drawn, everything else followed. I didn't stay in touch with most of the people who had been in that conference room, not out of bitterness, but because our roles in each other's lives had ended the moment. The paper crossed the table. When I did hear updates, they arrived secondhand and uncolored, which made them easier to understand without attachment. The part that stayed with me wasn't the threat or the deadline, it was the assumption behind them, the belief that pressure could replace respect without consequence. That assumption turned out to be expensive, not because anyone set out to punish it, but because it failed under scrutiny. If there was revenge in any of this, it wasn't dramatic or personal, and it didn't require a final confrontation. It lived in the quiet competence of a system that worked because the people inside it were treated as necessary rather than convenient. It lived in the absence of fear where it used to operate unchecked. Looking back, the most telling moment wasn't the offer or the resignation or even the fallout, it was the silence after, when nothing collapsed and nothing needed to be defended. That silence confirmed what the meeting had. Denied. Value doesn't disappear when it's discounted. It just moves to where it's recognized. I didn't lose my job that day. I lost something quieter. I lost the illusion that loyalty would be returned in the same currency. What saved me wasn't anger or courage, but preparation I'd been doing without realizing it. Every note I kept, every follow-up email, every promise written down became weight when words stopped working. In that conference room, they relied on pressure and speed. I relied on records, patience, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you've built. That difference decided everything. The experience took time from my family and sleep from my nights, but it gave me back control over my days. I learned that strength doesn't announce itself. It sits quietly in folders, calendars, and the discipline to document instead of vent. If I had one piece of advice for a friend, it would be this. Don't rush to react. Build your leverage before you need it. And never assume the system remembers what you've contributed unless you've written it down. That quiet work is what carries you when the room turns cold. I share this not to sound brave, but to remind you that quiet preparation often outlasts loud authority, especially when decisions are rushed and respect disappears inside conference rooms and rushed deadlines without warning given. How to get started today. Keep a simple record of your responsibilities, wins, and promises. Save emails and documents that show your real scope of work. Read your contract once a year, even when things feel stable. Build relationships based on trust, not titles. Pause before reacting when pressure is used as a weapon. Thank you for listening, and if this sounded familiar, your own story may already be unfolding, and I'll be back to talk about it next time.